an honor to be up here with you. Hank and I worked together in the late 1980s, 1986 to 88, on the negotiation to get the Cuban troops out of Angola, also the South Africans, to end the external intervention in the Angolan Civil War. And I was privileged to be on the team that was led by Hank in his capacity as in the NSC and by Chet Crocker, the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. So we'd like to invite anyone who would like to come down in either aisle and pose a question. While you're lining up, maybe I'll start. Hank, you worked for administrations of both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, and sometimes it's a criticism of American foreign policy that we don't pay enough attention to Africa and African matters. How hard did you find it as a senior policy figure working on Africa to get the kind of attention from senior political leaders that it took to get the job done?
Well, basically there were so many other crises going on and so many other problems that our leaders were facing in world affairs that it was hard to get their attention on Africa. I found President Bush to be one who paid more attention than most others. He was always willing to invite African leaders to come to the White House. He would either have lunch with them, or occasionally, maybe a couple times a year, have a state dinner with somebody who was prestigious. But he always kept an eye out as to what's going on in Africa. And I remember he was very, very friendly to the Africans. And he more than any other president knew what the Africans were talking about, whereas most of the other presidents did not. And so I found that he was one of the few who paid some attention to Africa, not a lot. I remember, when he had a lunch for an African head of state, after the lunch, the Assistant Secretary of State, me, had to go before the press and say, the president just saw the president of Gabon. He just had lunch with the president of Tanzania, and give a little readout as to what happened. So there was one week in which there were two of those. And I went before the White House press and made these two statements. And Helen Thomas, remember Helen Thomas?
Yeah.
She was the dean of the journalist corps. She looks at me and said, "What's going on here? 2 official visits from Africa in 1 week. What is going on?" So I said, Ms. Thomas, President Bush has authorized me to tell you that Africa is now the most important aspect of his foreign policy. But anyway, it was good for me to be assistant secretary because nobody bothered me. I could make a lot of policy, and I only got chewed out about twice in 4 years. So that was pretty good.
Let's take a question from the right side, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Cohen, for a very interesting talk. The history of Africa with the European powers, and you mentioned we stayed out with the Louisiana Purchase. Today, what are the influential countries that are active in Africa from outside of Africa, and what are their objectives and modes of operation, perhaps including our own country?
That's an excellent question. Well, the former colonial powers have never lost their interest in Africa. They provided a lot of technical assistance. I remember the French colonial civil servants who served in Africa, they were immediately transformed into foreign aid employees. And they remained, they trained the Africans to replace them. And they still are very active, especially in business. They've maintained their business ties, and they do very well. I think their trade relations are very good, and they provide a lot of advice. And also in the security side, the French especially have been quite willing to send troops to fight the terrorists. You see this now in the Sahel region, which is up here. And President Hollande of France, he's quite willing to send the troops to help our buddies in Africa against against terrorists. So they're very active. Okay, now in addition to that, you have a lot of other countries who have come into Africa to do all sorts of things. The Chinese are very big. Now, the Chinese, people often ask me, aren't the Chinese going against American interests in Africa? Nobody in the State Department or the Defense Department has ever told me that we worry about the Chinese in Africa. The people who have to worry about the Chinese in Africa are the Africans, because they're ripping them off in many ways, in many ways. The way the Chinese came in was a barter arrangement. They needed a lot of commodities, so they would go to a country that's producing oil. They'll say, okay, if you can guarantee us 100,000 barrels a day, for which we will pay world prices, we will do all sorts of things for you. We'll build roads, we'll build dams, we'll have investments and that sort of thing, which is great. There's nothing against that. But the problem is they exploit a lot of Africans in many ways. Sometimes they bring a lot of their own labor instead of hiring Africans. And when they do hire Africans, they treat them very badly. When I was teaching at Johns Hopkins, I had a student who spent the summer going to Africa, looking at what the Chinese were doing. And she told a story of she went to a Chinese mine owner, and she said, you know, conditions for the African workers here are pretty bad. And he said, well, I don't see why you say it's bad. We treat them just the way we treat our own Chinese workers in China. So that explains a lot. So the Africans are now starting, the bloom is off the rose on what the Chinese are doing now, but they're still heavily there. Now, the United States is very big on foreign aid, but very, very small on investments in business. Because of all these issues of the rule of law, enforcement of contracts and that sort of thing, American business finds it very risky. It tends to stay away. But it's starting to change. One of the biggest copper mines in the world now is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's an Arizona firm called Freeport-McMoRan. And the ore content there is 3%. Now you say, well, 3%, that's not much. Arizona copper is 0.5%, and they're making profits in Arizona. So consider 3% copper. It's a very valuable thing. So this company has poured a lot of money into it. They're being well treated. And I mentioned Ford Motor is starting an assembly plant. Of course, the oil companies have been there all the time. Oil companies have no choice. They have to go where the oil is. And American oil companies are the biggest in Africa. So our presence is quite large. But our main presence is not investors, it's foreign aid. Right.
How about on the left?
Howdy. Howdy. My name is Chris Shirley. I'm a first-year student at the Bush School. In Paul Collier's book, The Bottom Billion, he mentions one of the worst problems for development is bad governance, and he cites some several examples in Africa. And you mentioned a lot of failure of economic policies, including infrastructure spending and modernization of agriculture. I was wanting to get what your opinion was on which is more important, governance or some of the underlying economic infrastructure.
Well, everything starts from what we call good governance. I ask myself the question when I talk to an African leader, what does he think of when he gets up in the morning? What does he think of? Now, good governance means when he gets up in the morning, he says, what am I going to do for my people today, right? But unfortunately, most of them don't think that. They usually think of, how am I going to help my family today? How am I going to help my ethnic group today? You see? How am I going to give out jobs to people I like, and that sort of thing? And how are we going to cream off some money from some of this copper revenue and put it into private hands, you see? You don't see this push. Economic development, sustainable economic development should be job one for every African leader. And there are not too many of them. Some of them are starting, like I mentioned, the president of Senegal now, the president of Ivory Coast, also known as Côte d'Ivoire, the official name. Business people are flocking in there because they've set up the atmosphere. The term of art is called enabling environment for private investors. And it's starting to happen now in places like Botswana, Namibia, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Kenya. It's starting to happen. Ethiopia is another place. So it's a question of getting more modern, younger leaders who understand what's going on. Some of the initial leaders never could grasp. Some of them said, all we have to do is have socialism and everything will be okay, you see. That's what they were taught by the British and French in those days. So government is first. Governance is first.
Andrew, on the right.
The chief economist for AID, Steve Radlett, is now a professor at Georgetown. He just came out with a new book called The Great Surge, in which he looks at the developing world, but particularly Africa. And he did a book with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia. And what they said is we shouldn't really generalize about all of Africa because there are two Africas. There are 20 countries in Africa that have for 20 years had peaceful democratic systems of governance. And they've grown at about 3% growth rate each year. And the countries that had autocratic forms of government had minus 2% growth. So there's a big difference. Now you say 3% is not very much. In fact, the United States' average growth rate from the American Revolution until post-World War II was 2% a year. But it does add up. It builds on itself. That these growth rates that China's had are really not normal. I might add the two fastest growth rates in the world right now are not China. China's dropping dramatically, as you know. Ethiopia has a 12% growth rate, and Ghana has a 12% growth rate. Ghana actually is from natural gas, but they are a democracy. They've been a democracy for 20 years. Ethiopia is not a democracy, but they are growing at a very rapid rate in doing huge infrastructure projects, which they are self-financing. They're not getting loans from the World Bank to do it. So my question to you is, you did say there were a few countries, but there is a difference between the democratic countries in Africa and the autocracies in terms of their growth rates. Did you notice that, or did you observe that in your book at all?
That's a good issue. I'm not sure I can correlate democracy in our sense, with growth rates. I haven't seen that yet. For example, Nigeria, which became a democratic country in 1999 after many years of military rule. Nigeria produces 2.9 million barrels of oil a day. Now, when the prices was $100 until recently, there's tremendous revenue coming in. So if the price of a barrel of oil went, say, from $90 to $100, Nigeria's GNP went up 2%, just from that alone. But that doesn't really mean anything. This type of economic growth is different from other types of economic growth. So you have to look at how are resources being used and who's getting it and who's not getting it. But as a generality, I would say the democracies of Africa, including Nigeria, are doing better than the authoritarian. Nigeria, which is a very dysfunctional country, I would invest my money there now because it's such a free place to invest money. They don't bother you. They just said, go ahead and make money. But the government is terribly dysfunctional, which is bad for the people. They don't have schools all the time. They don't have electric power. But if you want to go there and make money, well, that's a great place. Terrific. But as a generality, I would say democracies do better. Right.
On the left?
Yes, Tim Herman. Some scattered thoughts and observations. Africa has been Africans have been very involved in Codex Alimentarius, which is the global food standard setting body. And the U.S. has played a key role in preparing those African delegations in terms of their negotiations and participation in Codex meetings. And we certainly are fighting over the hearts and minds for the Africans compared to the Europeans, who have somewhat of a different view, but are their most closest marketplace. So some thoughts about Codex Alimentarius, which of course is one of the UN organizations. A second thought that you may also be able to address. It's my understanding that the U.S. does not have a tax treaty with Kenya, which makes it very difficult for a university such as Texas A&M to engage in much of the activities in terms of extending our influence under a tax-exempt status. Furthermore, we're prohibited from engaging local attorneys to help us negotiate through their complex regulatory environment. So a tax treaty certainly would help. And then finally, to reinforce your thought about Power Africa, when visiting a feed mill in Morocco funded by the World Bank, built by the Germans, used about 3 times the kilowatt hour per ton to produce feed than what we do in the United States. So certainly there is a power shortage, but it's been induced in part by transferring technology that uses a whole lot more electricity than what, let's say, we would use in the United States to produce a comparable product. So a wide range of things if you'd like to jump in on any of those.
Well, I agree with you. In addition to having so many deficits in things like agriculture and electricity, what they do have is so much more expensive. I remember in Cote d'Ivoire, it was cheaper to get meat from France than from neighboring Mali, because they just, Mali doesn't have any abattoirs. So what they do is they take their herds and they walk them 100 miles down south where you can't have livestock because of disease. And when they march them 100 miles, they lose half their weight. So all of these changes, these modernizations have to take place. And it's not that difficult to do. I've been beating up on the people in Mali and Niger and in Chad. Look, you have millions of livestock. Why don't you get modern abattoirs? It's not that expensive. And get some refrigerated trucks and ship the meat down. You have contracts with prisons, with schools, with government ministries, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of improvement that can take place. It's just political will, and also the type of governance which allows this to happen. By the way, one thing I forgot to mention as an inhibitor of development is what I call illegitimate surrogate wars. There have been a number of African leaders, including a few that I write about in the book, who have said, I don't like that neighbor. I don't like that neighbor of mine for a lot of reasons. Well, what I'm going to do is sponsor a rebel group in his country, give them money and arms, and let them overthrow this corrupt guy who I don't like. It'll be a piece of cake. 60 days, it'll be over. Well, in Liberia, when three neighboring countries decided to overthrow the regime there, it led to a 7-year war. That is very costly in terms of development. The same thing in the Eastern Congo. A long war has been going on since 1998. It's still going on. Lots of people are dying because they can't cultivate the land, they can't get health care, and all sorts of things. So that's another element that has been holding Africa back, is what I call illegitimate surrogate wars. Okay, next question.
Morton, or I'm sorry, you go ahead, and then Morton.
I'm not an expert on Africa, but I have a son that lives in South Sudan, in Juba, and he's been there several years, and I've gone to visit him several times. And I'm just, when you just mentioned about the intrusion, I'm thinking about Bashir from Sudan. I've become just reading, talking with him a lot, and putting in military intrusion, it seems like, to destabilize somewhat. But it's such a, I'm just wondering, Kerry's been in and out the last year there. We've had high level, seems like, influence. I think the recent UN, the head has declared a great disaster there. And two tribal, I guess, the Nuer and the Dinka, new government, 2 years old. I'm bouncing around here, but What, in that case, how do you approach, or what do you see as a diplomatic approach to that